Hello everybody, here's a short video on a little Polish history that ties into things that you're going to be reading about in this story. Now, I personally believe literature should stand on its own, right? You should be able to read the story and get something out of it. If you need a ton of explanation or you need to know that the writer was this or the writer was that, I'm not big on that. Right. I mean, it's why we get some of that crazy art stuff, right? That maybe it's good, maybe it's not, or maybe we're just watching it because the person, the artist, has a good story. Well, that being said, context matters. And if you want to see a great example of that, really go on Netflix, go to the library, go to the foreign film section, and pick out a couple World War II movies. And you will see, if you watch a German World War II movie, it is very different than an American World War II movie, right? Spoiler alert, probably everybody's going to be dead at the end, right? And then if you watch a Russian movie about World War II, it's not going to be the great, number one, it's not even World War II, it's the Great Patriotic War, and it's going to have a totally different feel than an American one. And if you really want to have fun, watch an Italian movie about World War II, and that's even its whole other thing, right? And then you throw in a Japanese movie on World War II, and you will see they all look at the war very differently based on what happened to their country and their role in it. So Poland has a very interesting history, and one of the most interesting things about it is it was gone for like over 100 years. Around the late 1800s, it got partitioned by the larger groups around it, and then after World War I, they said, okay, Poland, you're a country again. So around 1920, Poland once again becomes a country. Right shortly thereafter, the Soviets invade, and the smaller Polish army defeats them along the Wisła, which is a river. They call it the Miracle of the Wisła. And wow, right, they kept their country. And then 19 years later, 1939, Germany, much stronger, invades from the east. 2 weeks later, Russia invades from the west, and they had no chance. And so they have been, taken over. A family story. My uncle-in-law grew up in Poland, and basically, the German army came, and he tells this story about how he remembers standing up in this classroom saying, I want to be a candy maker when he was a kid. And right when he was around 17, the German army shows up, and he's in the German army. And he spent the next 4 years fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. And that was it. It wasn't a choice. I mean, here you go. And he survived, wounded 7 times. And his wife told me later, I only heard him talk about World War II like twice. And she said even 40 years later, if he talked about the war during the day, he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. So he, kept that with him. Not everybody reacts the way he does, and all of that stuff thrown in there, but holy crap. He also has a funny story of having both arms have been wounded, and he's in a cast like this. And luckily for him, the Americans showed up at his hospital, and they said, like, arms up! And he thought that was very funny. This Russians had a different practice with prisoners, which was basically, you destroyed our country, come over here, and German prisoners in the Soviet Union spent the next 5 to 7 years rebuilding the country, right? Which goes to Poland. Poland, invaded by both sides, was utterly devastated. Actually, there was one place, I'm going to change this up. There was one city, Torun, and this is a picture of it, that basically out of all of the country, this was the one, for whatever reasons of geography, it wasn't destroyed. But basically, Poland was leveled, and so when Borowski got out of the camp and went home, he went home to a devastated country. Actually, not even, well, we know from reading this that he left and came back. But in Poland, the country was just like so much of Germany and Poland and parts of France, and you name the country, leveled. And one thing that didn't help is in Warsaw, there was an uprising where um, a bunch of, not a bunch, so many people in Warsaw rose up against the Germans, and the Soviet army stopped at the river when the uprising happened and just let the Germans take out as many people as they could. And then once the uprising was over, and I believe about 200,000 Polish people were killed, then the Soviet army came over. Um, Hard to say the Soviets were any friends of the Polish people. They also took, I can't remember if it was 1,000 or 10,000, but somewhere in that range of Polish officers out into the woods in Katyn and massacred them during the war. Because if you're going to take over a country, you don't want them to have strong leaders. So they killed over 1,000 and like finally admitted it in the 90s. So as you can see, he did not, after this war, like American soldiers, get on a ship, have a month to decompress, come back to a country that wasn't torn up. He returned, or he was in, a country that was destroyed. Right? I also found out that there were 2.9 million Jews, Polish Jews killed, and there was also an additional 2.8 ethnic Poles, right? So Poles that don't identify as Jewish, 2.8 million who were killed by the Germans throughout the course of the war. And the Russians killed, I believe a couple 100,000 too on their own, besides just those officers. Now, later on Thursday, we're going to get into literary criticism. The first one, we're going to start with feminism, but there is one called, well, in the handout, if you've looked at it, it's post-structuralism, deconstruction, postmodernism. They're kind of all put together. That one will have some really interesting questions that can tie into the writer's background and things about the story. A few other things, right? So actually, this is me, a young, thin me, right, with Piotra. We met when I was hanging out there for a while. And what was really interesting, this goes to show context. It's a nice story. So this was in the 90s. And when I went to Poland, and now we're moving away from the story, but I want to talk about context because we always have to think about context in any sort of situation if we fully want to not fully understand it, because that's impossible, but at least to get a better idea about it. So when I was in Poland, I went to a restaurant called Jazz Pizza, and it had all these jazz grates painted on the side, and there was this really big love of the West, love of President Reagan, and I'm like, what's going on here? And with Soviet control of Poland, right, all the way up until Solidarność started, and these things in the 80s, the West was this icon of freedom, right? This and Reagan, right, who, for those of you who are too young, right, this is when the wall went down. Part of it from Reagan's like, man, we're going to spend a ton of money on weapons. Soviets try to spend a ton of money on weapons, and basically they go bankrupt first. So, yay, weapons. But very popular in Poland, right? Why? Because they see him as standing up strongly to the Soviet Union, and why in the world wouldn't they be happy about that and look up to him? So a little piece of context there. I did go, when I was in Kraków, Auschwitz in Poland is like a half an hour away, not that far away. So I took a couple pictures kind of on the outskirts, and I sure as heck didn't on the inside. I got to tell you, being there, places have vibes, that is for sure. I mean, it was just eerie and spooky, and just, I sure felt something about, as far as this is not a good place, right? And of course, the city wasn't that big or anything close to it, but I mean, you can see that city was not that far away when this is taking place. And the one other photo I want to show you, in this, under the dome, and you can see right there, is actually the remains, ash and bone of the victims. And It's very powerful. And I didn't take a picture because it sure did not seem appropriate. Now, one thing I want to say as we're looking at this picture is some setups that we use that make sense typically don't all the time. And here's one of them. When it comes to the Holocaust, sometimes there are Holocaust deniers out there. And if you're one, fine, whatever. But it doesn't make sense to give somebody who's a Holocaust denier anything even to the close space of the rest of us. You can walk through the camps. You can talk to people who have tattoos on your arm. We have, 10,000 GIs who went over there and saw it. We have the film. Yet, in discussion, we like to have two sides, right? And there's a false equivalency there in a stupidity that can happen where, and not so much now, but you actually see in the past, you have somebody talking about the Holocaust, and the moderator feels like, well, so we have to have a denier, and that is insane. Everybody can have an opinion. All opinions are not equally valid. So something like denying that this happened when we have all the evidence in the world, it's bonkers, right? But if we set up in a system where if you have a yes and a no, then you're going to end up sometimes with weird things like that. One more thing that I want to say is that's interesting about this story is that it's actually not written by a Jewish person. Of course, the majority of people killed during the Holocaust were Jewish people, but there's a couple million non-Jewish people who were killed too, and that's context. So there's going to be plenty of similarities and some differences, right? If you are a targeted group that is meant for genocide, and your experience is probably going to be different than a group that's not. Our whole group hasn't been targeted for genocide. We want to wipe you off the face of the earth. I'm just stuck in this group. Like our author, right, who had the nerve to try to get an education and would write things when, nobody was supposed to be able to write. Think about that. There are times in this world where people will risk their lives to get educated. They will risk their lives to express themselves. Yeah. Think about that the next time you want to complain about education. Or don't. You do whatever the heck you want. Now, as you read this story, that's some context that might just give you a little bit of window about what was going around on that time, a little bit of Polish history. Each country is different. Each country focuses on different things. Each country remembers things differently. All right, 2 more videos to come who are local. It's going to be getting really cold soon, so I hope you stay warm. And heck, actually, I think one of our out-of-towners is just getting blasted with this stuff too. So stay warm. Great week for reading. All right, talk to you later.